SELSI, Spoken Easy Language for Social Inclusion.
Thank you. So, first of all, I would like to thank the organization for inviting me, and to say that for me it's really a pleasure to be here with you and see so many familiar faces and friendly faces. And I just hope that when I finish, you will not be thinking, well, I left my coffee because of that. Okay, so one more thing. I will be kind of reading my presentation, and the reason for me to do this is because I know myself. And if I don't do it, I will probably go over time. And I don't want that, so let's go. So I'm really excited to be here today and to talk to you about a topic that it's dear for me. And it's about how can we ensure that accessible communication is available for people with intellectual disabilities, and also why this must be seen as a basic human right. Yeah. So communication is a key part of our lives, and it's the way we understand the world, it's the way that we make decisions, it's how we connect with others. So this is the reality for most of us, but for many people with intellectual disabilities, communication can often be a barrier. And that barrier limits their ability to access important information and to take part fully in society. So today I will try to talk a little bit about why accessible communication is essential, how it affects human rights, and why inclusion for people with intellectual disabilities can only happen when we break down these barriers. I will talk about different types of communication, and I will be not assuming that people know about it already. I will be assuming that at least one person that can be listening don't know about it, so I will, sorry if for some of you this is not new, but I will do it like that. So I will talk a little bit about different types of communication, written, spoken, and visual, and why is it crucial that each of these forms is made more accessible. So let's start about looking at why communication itself should be considered as a human right. So communication is much more than just exchanging information. It's the foundation of human rights. Being able to understand, express yourself, and make decisions is central to living with dignity. When communication is not accessible, people with intellectual disabilities are often excluded from the decision-making process that affects their lives. This exclusion goes beyond inconvenience. It's a denial of their basic human rights. So the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, so that's the big word that we were listening earlier, recognize that that people have the right to accessible information. And this means that people with disabilities should be able to understand the information they receive, whether it's from their doctor, their school, or their government. Without access to clear, understandable communication, people with intellectual disabilities can't make informed decisions about their health, their education, or legal matters. So inaccessible communication limits a person's ability to fully take part in society. It can prevent someone from understanding a medical diagnosis or to advocate in areas that are important, like healthcare, education, and family. When communication barriers exist, they create a world where people with intellectual disabilities are set aside and are often overlooked. This is why accessible communication is not just a good practice, it's a human right. Without it, people with intellectual disabilities are denied the opportunity to fully engage in their own lives. So, inclusion means more than just physical presence. It means full participation. For people with intellectual disabilities, inclusion happens when they can access the same opportunities as everyone else. And this starts with accessible communication. When communication is made simpler and clearer, it gives people the possibility to make informed choices, be active in their communities, and stand up for their rights. Imagine being in a classroom where the language is too complex, or visiting a hospital and not being able to understand what the doctor is saying about your treatment. These are daily challenges for people with intellectual disabilities, and they create a situation where individuals are left out of important decisions that directly impact their lives. So accessible communication is key to ensuring that people with intellectual disabilities are included and empowered in every aspect of life, whether that's understanding their rights in a legal setting, making informed health decisions, or taking part in education and employment. To create full inclusion, we need to make sure that all forms of communication, written, spoken, and visual, are accessible. So let's take a look at each one of those. So we have heard a lot about written communication today already. So written information such as forms that we have seen, signs and instructions is something we encounter every day. But think for a moment, how often do we encounter written information that is really hard for us to understand? For people with intellectual disabilities, much of the written world can feel like a maze. Complex sentences, legal jargon, unfamiliar words, all of these make it difficult to engage with even the most basic aspects of life. Imagine trying to read through a healthcare form filled with terms like eligibility criteria or non-disclosure agreements when you are struggling with complex language. It's not just frustrating, it can be disempowering. That's where easy-to-read formats come in. Easy-to-read formats are designed to make written information accessible by simplifying the language, breaking down complex ideas into short sentences, and often using picture or symbols to reinforce the message. For example, instead of saying you are eligible for these services based on specific criteria, an easy-to-read version might say you can use these services if you meet the rules. If you have problems or doubts, just ask others. This simple adjustment can make a world of difference. Suddenly, the information becomes inclusive and not exclusive. Accessible written information is especially important in legal settings or when we need to sign contracts. Think about how intimidating a legal document can be, and we have heard about it already today. Now imagine facing these documents with an intellectual disability. If the language is too complex, it can prevent someone from fully understanding their rights and their obligations. Easy-to-read formats empower people to engage with the written word in ways that ensure their rights are respected and their voices are heard. So for spoken communication can be as challenging as written communication, if not more, for people with intellectual disabilities. We have all experienced moments when someone is speaking too quickly, using too many complex words, or making assumptions about what we already know. In those moments, it's easy to feel lost. For people with intellectual disabilities, this feeling of being left behind in conversations can be a daily reality. This is where spoken easy language, the focus of the SELSI project, can make a huge difference. Spoken easy language involves slowing down, using simple, clear words, and explaining things in ways that are easy to follow. This isn't about talking down to people. It's about making sure that everyone is on the same page. For example, let's think about a visit to a doctor. The doctor might explain a diagnosis or treatment plan, but if they use medical jargon or talk too fast, it's likely the person with an intellectual disability won't fully understand what's being said. If they don't understand, they can't make an informed decision about their treatment. When doctors and healthcare providers take the time to simplify their language and ensure that their patients understand, it empowers people with intellectual disabilities to take control of their own health decisions. And this doesn't just apply to healthcare in everyday conversations, in the workplace or in schools, ensuring that spoken communication is clear and understandable and can make a huge difference between inclusion and exclusion. Now let's talk about visual communication. So this form of communication often feels like the most intuitive. After all, a picture is worth 1,000 words, right? Well, not always. While pictures, symbols, and pictograms can certainly help make communication more accessible, they come with their own challenges. Pictograms, for instance, are often seen as a kind of universal language, but that's not always the case. Let me explain. Pictograms, the small symbols we see in public spaces, on signs, or in healthcare settings, are meant to provide quick visual information. But pictograms are not automatically easy to understand. In fact, they can even add a layer of difficulty. For example, a simple image of a person walking with an arrow pointing to a door might seem obvious to some of us. It's an exit sign, right? Well, not everyone interprets symbols the same way, especially if they come from different cultural backgrounds or haven't been taught what the symbol means. So when we use pictograms or other visual aids, it's essential to pair them with clear, easy-to-read text or spoken explanations. Otherwise, we risk to adding this additional layer of complexity. This is why visual communication, while extremely powerful, needs to be used thoughtfully. When done correctly, it can support inclusion, but we have to make sure that visual aids we use are truly helping people and not confusing them further. So if we think about what I have been talking, it's easy to see how accessible communication has a direct impact on the ability of people with intellectual disabilities to exercise their human rights. Whether it's in healthcare, education, or legal matters, having access to clear, understandable communication ensures that people with intellectual disabilities can make informed decisions about their lives. In healthcare, accessible communication is essential. Think about family decisions making or reproductive health. For people with intellectual disabilities, particularly women and girls, accessing clear, understandable information about reproductive health can be incredibly challenging. Medical language is often full of jargon, and even well-meaning healthcare providers can sometimes make assumptions about what a patient already knows. For women with intellectual disabilities, being excluded from these conversations can have serious consequences. Without accessible information, they may not be able to make informed decisions about contraception, pregnancy, or their reproductive health. This lack of access can leave them vulnerable to making decisions without understanding the full picture, or worse, having others making decisions for them. In this context, accessible communication, whether it's spoken language, easy-to-read written materials, or visual aids, plays a critical role in ensuring that women with intellectual disabilities have the same rights as everyone else to make informed decisions about their health and bodies. In education, clear communication is essential also to ensure that students with intellectual disabilities can learn and engage with the curriculum. Education is one of the most important rights we have, and it's the foundation for personal growth and development. But for many people with intellectual disabilities, traditional education systems have significant barriers. If the language used in schools is too complex, or the teaching methods aren't accessible, students with intellectual disabilities are at risk of being left behind. And when that happens, it limits their opportunities for learning, personal growth, and future employment. Imagine being in a classroom where the teacher is moving too quickly, using terms you don't understand, and not providing any visual aids or simplified explanations. It is not just frustrating, it excludes you. This is the reality for many students with intellectual disabilities. So we need to ensure that our educational systems are designed to be inclusive. This means providing teaching materials in easy-to-read formats, using clear spoken language in the classrooms, and incorporating visual aids that are easy to understand. It also means training teachers to communicate in ways that support all learners, not just the ones that are easily kept up. Inclusive education doesn't just benefit students with intellectual disabilities, it makes learning environment better for everyone. When communication is accessible, everyone has the opportunity to succeed. So it's also important to acknowledge how gender, race, and social background intersect with intellectual disability to create additional barriers to communication. For example, if you think about a woman with an intellectual disability that is also belonging to a racial or ethnic group minority, and she is facing already discrimination because of her disability, she can also face it because of her background. So she may have limited access to healthcare, education, or employment, and when she does access these services, the information provided might not be accessible for her. So in schools also, if schools are offering teaching materials in languages and formats that were accessible for students from diverse backgrounds, it would also be something that will make sure that we are providing them with the education that they need. So when we think about accessible communication, it's not just about making things accessible and easier for people with intellectual disabilities. It's about creating a society where everyone, regardless of their gender, race, background, or abilities, has the opportunity to participate fully. So, how do we move forward from here? How do we ensure that accessible communication becomes a standard practice in all areas of life? It's important to recognize that communication barriers don't just affect people with intellectual disabilities, they affect everyone. Clear, accessible communication benefits all of us. When governments, organizations, and service providers make an effort to communicate clearly and inclusively, they create environments where everyone can take part. Governments need to set clear standards for accessible communication. This means creating guidelines that apply across sectors like education, healthcare, and public services. It also means investing in training for professionals, whether they are teachers, healthcare providers, or service workers, so they can communicate in ways that are inclusive and accessible. Projects like SELSI shows us how spoken easy language can be integrated into everyday communication. But we need to extend these principles to all forms of communication, whether it's written, spoken, or visual. We also need to advocate for inclusive policies in all areas of life. Accessible communication is not just a technical fix. It's about changing attitudes and recognizing that everyone deserves to be seen, heard, and understood. So, to close it up, accessible communication is more than just a way of making things easier to understand. It's a tool for empowerment. When communication is accessible, people with intellectual disabilities can participate fully in society, make informed decisions, and access and exercise their human rights. Accessible communication benefits all of us. It creates a more inclusive, equitable world where no one is left behind. When we promote accessible communication in education, healthcare, justice, and other areas, we are taking concrete steps toward building a society where everyone can thrive and fully participate. So thank you.
SELSI, Spoken Easy Language for Social Inclusion. Partners are Zavod Risa, RTV Slovenija, Dyslexieverbundet, Università degli Studi di Pavia, Vieglas Valodas Agentura, Vilnius Universitetas, Vsi informacijos kaupimo ir sklaidos centras. Funded by the European Union.